The chandelier light at the Meridian Arts Center scattered across the marble floor like broken diamonds, and Mara Callister stood alone near the ost wall, one hand pressed gently against her belly. 8 months. The baby had been kicking all morning, restless, as if she already sensed her mother's unease. Mara kept her smile steady, the way she always did at events like this, the kind of charity exhibition she'd organized 3 years running, the kind Joel once called the most important thing you do. He hadn't shown up tonight. The invitation had been sent to his office 6 weeks ago. He'd confirmed twice. But his chair near the front row sat empty, and Mara had stopped checking her phone 40 minutes ago. She was still wearing the navy dress she'd picked out with her mother's voice in her head. Something elegant, something timeless. The baby bump made it harder to feel elegant. But the women around her kept touching her arm and saying she glowed, and she was starting to believe them, just barely, when the entrance doors swung open and Priya Dolan walked in. Every conversation near the entrance dropped half a decibel. Priya moved like someone who had rehearsed an entrance, her gold silk top catching the chandelier light, dark hair loose over one shoulder. She'd already lifted a champagne glass from a passing tray before she'd fully stepped inside. And she was looking directly at Mara. "I heard this was your event," Priya said, cutting through the crowd between them like she belonged there. "Joel always said you pour everything into causes that don't pay you back." Mara felt the air shift. Around them a few heads turned. She recognized some of these people, board members, donors, teachers from her school district. She straightened her back. "Priya," she kept her voice level, "this isn't the place." "No?" Priya tilted her head. The champagne glass caught the light. "Where's the right place then? Because I've been waiting for one for a long time." She stepped closer, close enough that Mara could smell her perfume, sharp and expensive, the kind Joel had started bringing home on his collar 6 months ago. "He's not coming tonight," Priya said quietly, so only Mara could hear. "He's with me. He was always with me. The divorce paperwork is already drafted. You're just running out the clock, sweetheart." Mara opened her mouth. Before she could speak, Priya's elbow swung out, sharp, deliberate, and connected with Mara's shoulder. The force sent her stumbling backward into a display pedestal. The sculpture on top wavered. Someone screamed. Mara's back hit the corner of the exhibit wall, and a bolt of pain tore through her lower spine. She grabbed the edge of the nearest table, gasping, her hand flying to her stomach. The room erupted. Gallery staff rushed forward. A woman near the wine table shouted for someone to call an ambulance. Priya had already backed away, champagne glass still in hand, her expression cycling from rage to something cold and calculating. "She tripped," Priya said, loud enough for the room. "I barely touched her." But 3 cameras in the Meridian security system had caught every second of it, and across the city, Mara's father, Richard Callister, was already getting the call. 2 years earlier, Mara Callister had believed she'd married the right kind of man. She and Joel West had met at a fundraiser for the Chicago Public School Foundation. The kind of event she attended, because she cared, and he attended because it made for a good LinkedIn caption. She hadn't known that then. She'd seen his broad shoulders and easy smile, and the way he talked about architecture like it was something sacred, and she'd let herself fall. Her father had been cautious. Richard Callister had spent 30 years in the Senate, and another decade building Callister Capital into one of the Midwest's most respected private investment funds. He understood people the way engineers understood bridges. He could look at the structure and know exactly where the weight was wrong. He'd told Mara quietly over coffee in his study, "Joel is the kind of man who borrows confidence from whoever is standing next to him. Be careful whose confidence he borrows when you're not there." She hadn't listened. Their wedding had been small, a ceremony at the Chicago Cultural Center, orchids and natural light, 200 people who genuinely loved them. Joel had cried at the altar. She'd thought that meant something. For the first 18 months, it did. Joel's architecture firm grew steadily, and he credited Mara in interviews, called her his foundation. Richard, despite his reservations, had quietly directed 2 early investors toward Joel's firm. The infusion of capital helped West Design Group expand from a boutique shop into something that could bid on city contracts. Then the contracts came through, and Joel stopped crediting anyone. The late nights started gradually. Business dinners, networking events Mara wasn't invited to. She understood. She had her own career, her own obligations. But then came the perfume, the locked phone. The way he'd leave a room the moment a call came in. She found a hotel keycard in his jacket pocket in November. When she asked, he said it was from a conference in Milwaukee. She looked up the conference. It had been held in March. Priya Dolan had come onto Mara's radar through Instagram, the way these things always happen now. An interior designer with a polished feed, expensive taste, and a habit of posting photographs in Joel's favorite Chicago restaurants. Sometimes at tables Mara recognized, sometimes with a view she knew. When Mara first confronted Joel, he hadn't raised his voice. He'd simply looked at her across their kitchen island and said, "You're overthinking this. The pregnancy hormones are making you paranoid." Then he'd poured himself a glass of water and walked out of the room. That night she sat alone in the nursery she'd been building piece by piece, running her fingers along the unfinished edge of the crib rail. She'd bought it herself, assembled it herself. Joel had offered to help twice and forgotten both times. Outside the apartment window, Chicago hummed with its usual January cold. Car horns, a distant train, the particular quiet of the lake after midnight. She sat there for a long time thinking about the difference between loneliness and being alone. At dawn her phone buzzed, a tabloid notification from an account she'd never followed. Someone had tagged her. The photo showed Joel and Priya at a rooftop bar on New Year's Eve, hands clasped across a candlelit table. The caption read, "Chicago's power couple rings in the new year." Mara looked at that photograph for a very long time. Then she got up, packed a small bag, and drove to her father's building on Lakeshore Drive. Richard hadn't asked questions. He'd opened the door, taken her coat, and put the kettle on. She sat at his kitchen table the way she used to as a child. Shoulders low, hands wrapped around a mug, and he sat across from her and said nothing until she was ready. When she finally said Priya's name, something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise, recognition. The kind that comes from having already suspected something you'd prayed you were wrong about. "How far along are you?" he asked. 27 weeks. He nodded once. "You'll stay here until you decide what comes next." He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without decoration, but she heard what he meant underneath it. "You are not alone." The ambulance reached the Meridian in under 8 minutes. Mara's obstetrician met her at Northwestern Memorial's emergency obstetric wing. The pain in her back had dulled to a deep throb, and the baby's heartbeat came through the monitor, steady and strong. The nurse held the wand gently against her stomach and smiled in a way that told Mara the news was not bad. Still, Mara's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Richard arrived 37 minutes after the call. He came through the hospital corridor in his charcoal overcoat, moving with the kind of measured urgency that never becomes a sprint. And when he stepped into the room and saw Mara's pale face against the white pillow, the monitoring wires, the bruising already darkening along her forearm, he stopped walking, just for a second. Then he came to her bedside and took her hand between both of his without saying a word. His assistant, Leo Ferris, followed him in. Leo had worked alongside Richard for 16 years. He was lean and precise, the kind of man who spoke in complete sentences and never wasted one. He set a black folder on the counter near the sink without being asked. "The Meridian's security director has already secured the footage," Leo said. 3 camera angles. Clear visual confirmation. The contact was deliberate. She used her elbow, angled forward. Mara closed her eyes. "And Joel?" Richard asked quietly. Leo paused. "He was notified by hospital administration 45 minutes ago." "Has he arrived?" "No." The words settled in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Richard turned back to Mara. When he spoke again, his voice was lower than she'd heard it in years. "You don't have to do anything right now. I'm going to handle what needs to be handled." "Dad." She opened her eyes. "I don't want another scandal. I've spent the whole pregnancy trying to keep things quiet." "This isn't about quiet anymore." His jaw tightened. "That woman walked into your event, in front of witnesses and cameras, and put her hands on you and your child. There's no version of this where we stay quiet." She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me what you're thinking." And Richard Callister, who had spent decades learning when to stay his hand and when to move it, told her. Joel West arrived at Northwestern Memorial 2 hours and 14 minutes after the first notification. He came in through the main entrance rather than the emergency wing, which told Leo everything he needed to know about how urgent the man considered the situation. Richard was standing in the hallway when Joel stepped off the elevator. Leo stood 2 paces behind. Joel saw Richard first and adjusted his expression, concern layered carefully over guilt, the kind of look Mara had grown used to seeing across their kitchen table. He started with, "I just heard. I came as fast as I." 2 hours, Richard said. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "My daughter was in the emergency room for 2 hours before you showed up." Joel spread his hands. "I was in a meeting. A contract review, it ran long, I couldn't just—" "Your wife was brought here by ambulance." Richard let that sentence sit between them. "Your unborn daughter was monitored for 2 hours to confirm she hadn't been harmed." He stepped closer. "And you were in a meeting." Joel's hands dropped. "Priya, whatever she said happened, she said it was an accident, that Mara lost her balance." Richard turned to Leo, who opened the folder and produced a still frame from the security footage. Priya's elbow connecting with Mara's shoulder, her body angled deliberately forward. Joel's face drained of color. "I didn't know she was going to." "Do what?" Richard's voice cut clean. "Go to an event your wife organized, or put her hands on her." Joel stared at the photograph for a long moment. "I want to talk to Mara," he said finally. "You'll have that chance," Richard said. "But first, we've also begun reviewing the investment records from Callister Capital's 2022 contribution to West Design Group." Something moved behind Joel's eyes. The guilt shifted into something sharper and more frightened. "That was a standard investment. It's not relevant to any of this." "It will be," Leo said quietly, "once our forensic accounting team finishes." Joel stood very still in the hospital hallway, the kind of stillness that looks like composure but is actually the moment before a fall. Then, "What do you want, Richard?" "I want my daughter safe," Richard answered. "Everything else is consequence." By morning, the story had moved from the society pages to the local news cycle. 3 witnesses at the Meridian had spoken to reporters before midnight. Within 6 hours of Mara's discharge, posts began circulating online, claiming she had staged the incident to gain sympathy during divorce proceedings. One anonymous account wrote, "Everybody knows she's been trying to keep him trapped with a baby. Ask anyone in their circle." Another posted a blurry screenshot, allegedly a text from Mara, painting her as unstable and vindictive. The text was fabricated. Leo had it traced to a marketing firm in Indianapolis registered 4 months prior under a name that matched no real business license. Richard reviewed the report at 5:30 in the morning, sitting in the chair by his window overlooking the lake, coffee cooling beside him. "She had help," Leo said. "This account infrastructure was built before last night. She planned for contingencies." Richard set down his cup with careful precision. Then she planned for the wrong one. The forensic accounting moved faster than expected. Callister Capital's 2022 contribution to West Design Group had been documented as a straight investment. What the audit revealed instead was a series of layered transactions. Invoices from a design consultancy called Dolan Creative, payments routed through West Design Group's operating account, and deposited into accounts Richard's team linked directly to Priya. Joel hadn't just kept a mistress. He'd been paying her for 18 months, using money that had come from the Callister family. Mara read the financial summary sitting in her father's window seat, one hand on her stomach, the February sky flat and gray over the lake. When she finished, she set the pages down. "He thanked my father at our rehearsal dinner," she said, "in front of everyone. He said the Callister money was what let them take on the city contracts." She paused. "And he was funneling part of it to her the whole time." Leo didn't answer. There was nothing useful to say. The courtroom on West Washington Street drew more press than the building had seen in years. The Chicago Tribune's legal correspondent described the case as a textbook collision of money, infidelity, and corporate misconduct. Mara arrived in a dark coat, her father on one side and Leo on the other, moving slowly, one hand resting on her belly. The courtroom gallery quieted when she entered, the particular stillness that falls over a room when people recognize they are looking at someone who has earned their composure the hard way. Priya sat at the defense table in a charcoal blazer. She looked smaller than she had at the gallery. The gold silk and the champagne glass felt like a costume she'd left at the door. The security footage played twice for the court. On the second viewing, Priya's attorney argued impaired perception, that the contact had been accidental, that Priya had reached toward Mara to prevent a fall rather than cause one. The prosecutor asked him to replay the audio captured by the gallery's ambient microphones, which had caught, faintly but unmistakably, Priya's voice saying, "You should have stayed home tonight." No one in that courtroom confused that for concern. Joel testified looking haggard and carefully groomed at the same time, the way men look when they've hired someone to make them presentable for something they're ashamed of. He admitted the relationship with Priya. He admitted the payments had been improper uses of business funds. He said he had not authorized or encouraged the attack at the Meridian. On cross-examination, the prosecutor asked him one question. "Mr. West, in the 6 weeks between the charity exhibition invitation and the night of the attack, did Ms. Dolan ever express hostility toward your wife?" Joel looked at the table. "Yes." "More than once?" "Yes." "And did you take any action to prevent her from attending an event your wife had organized and was attending alone, 8 months pregnant?" The silence lasted 4 full seconds. "No." The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. Priya Dolan, guilty of aggravated battery. 14 months in Cook County, mandatory counseling, permanent restraining order protecting Mara and her child. Joel West, civil liability for the fraudulent fund transfers, ordered to repay Callister Capital in full with interest. Stripped of his city contracts pending investigation. West Design Group filed for bankruptcy within the week. Mara sat in the row behind the prosecutor's table when the judge read the sentences. She'd expected to cry, but what she felt instead was something quieter and more permanent. The sensation of a door closing on a room she would never have to enter again. Outside the courthouse, a Channel 7 crew called out a question about whether she had a message for other women in her situation. She hadn't planned to stop, but she did, just for a moment, and she turned toward the microphone. "No one should have to choose between their safety and their dignity," she said. "That's all." She meant it as a statement of fact. By evening, it was running on every local broadcast. 3 weeks and 2 days later, Mara's daughter arrived at 7:41 in the morning. 6 pounds 4 ounces, lungs working perfectly, eyes wide open from the first moment. Richard was in the waiting room when the nurse came to find him. Later he told Mara that he'd stood up so fast, he knocked his coffee off the chair beside him, and hadn't noticed until he was already in the corridor. She named the baby Iris. She'd held the name privately for months, hadn't told anyone. When Richard came into the room and she said it out loud for the first time, something crossed his face she hadn't seen in years. Not pride exactly. Something older and more tender than that. "Your grandmother's middle name," he said. "I know," Mara said. There was one thing Mara didn't learn until 2 weeks after the verdict. Leo told her over coffee in her father's kitchen, while Iris slept down the hall. The night of the gallery attack, before the ambulance had even arrived, someone had uploaded a short video clip to a private file-sharing link and sent it anonymously to Richard's encrypted work email. The clip was from a personal phone, a different angle than any of the Meridian's official cameras. Low and close to the floor, catching Priya's expression in the half-second before her elbow connected. Deliberate. Unmistakable. It was the piece of footage that had made the prosecutor's case airtight. The sender had never come forward. Richard's cybersecurity team traced the upload to a coffee shop 2 blocks from the gallery. No further. 3 days after the verdict, a card arrived at Mara's new apartment near Lincoln Park. No return address. Inside, a single line in small, neat handwriting. "You deserved better from the beginning. Take care of that little one." Mara read it twice, standing in her entryway, Iris asleep in the carrier against her chest. She didn't know who had sent it, she might never know, but she folded it carefully and placed it in the box on her shelf, the one where she kept the things that mattered. There are people in this world who do right by you without needing credit for it. She had always believed that was true. Now she had proof. 6 weeks later, the Callister Foundation announced the Maternal Safety Initiative, a statewide program funding enhanced security protocols at Illinois civic venues, legal support for victims of harassment and domestic violence during pregnancy, and mental health resources for new mothers navigating family court. The full restitution from Joel's bankruptcy proceedings went directly to the fund's first-year operating budget. At the launch, Richard gave a brief speech. He was not a sentimental man in public, but at the end he paused and looked out at the room and said, "My daughter taught me that strength is not the absence of pain. It's what you build after." Mara was standing near the back with Iris warm against her chest, and she heard every word. She had not been naive enough to believe that the hardest parts of her life were finished. She knew better than that now, but for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she was standing in a room full of people, her daughter's small weight steady against her heart, and she felt, without reservation, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The road forward was hers, no one else's, and she intended to walk every mile of it.